We hear about populism and we go back to 2016 with the populism on the left from Bernie Sanders and the populism on the right from Donald Trump. But we see populism all over the country and all over the world for that matter. In England with Brexit, we see it in Poland. Now that's right-wing populism. But can you talk about the difference between the Sanders and the left-wing populism to Trump's right-wing populism?
Yeah. So in the book, I come up with three sort of variations on the word. So populism, in my mind, this is my definition, is a transracial movement of working people for economic democracy. So that's what the original populists were. That's what the labor movement was in the 30s. That's what the civil rights movement was trying to become when Martin Luther King got assassinated. And that's what the Sanders movement was. And what Trump is selling, and then there's anti-populism, which is what our sort of intellectual class is constantly selling us right now, telling us that populism is this evil thing, and movements of working people are dangerous because they're authoritarian and they're racist and they can never do anything right and that sort of thing. And they by the way, they say this while never ever talking about the movements in American history, which were the opposite of that. They weren't authoritarian, they were anti-racist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They never talk about those because that obviously, that ruins their whole theory. So they just ignore it. So that's anti-populism. And then the third thing is what I call fake populism, and that's Trump. And he talks this kind of in this folksy way, and he talks to ordinary people, and he seems to understand what they're feeling and what they're going through, and he promises all sorts of wonderful things. And he's not a new phenomenon in American life. This is George Bush did it. Before him, Newt Gingrich did it. Newt Gingrich was good at it. The Tea Party movement did it. Pat Buchanan was excellent at it. Ronald Reagan was a master of the form. Richard Nixon basically invented it. We've had this long string of these guys, and they talk this way, and they seem to be the friend of ordinary people, friend of the common man, and they get in power, and what do? You know the story. They cut taxes. They deregulate Wall Street. They sign these trade agreements. They do these terrible, terrible things, and then they promise you it's like, no, we're going to stand up for your values. And then you turn around one day and your town is in ruins. And your minimum wage is still lower than it was in the 60s or whatever. And, and there's no grocery store for 100 miles. And it's, and you're like, what the hell happened? Anyhow, that's an old story. So that's the story of what's the matter with Kansas. And I see Trump, I mean, all of this commentary, like you open up the Washington Post every day, there's 5 op-eds attacking Trump, always, every day. And they attack him as though he was this unholy thing that we've never seen ever before in American life, and this unbelievable demagogue who's off the charts. No, in my mind, Trump is a continuity. Trump is something very familiar. He is right out of the Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon mold. He's swiped all of his issues from Pat Buchanan. His ecumenical racism. This is like this. Pat Buchanan is where he gets this. His slogans come from Reagan. Some of the, he's a huge admirer of Richard Nixon. Right. And one of the really interesting things that I learned in writing this book, I don't know if you watch old movies, if you're a fan of I love old movies. So right. in the 1930s, the culture was extremely populist. The 30s was the great decade of sort of cultural populism in America. The Frank Capra movies, the WPA art, all this. But one of the classics of that period was a movie called Citizen Kane. Orson Welles made it. And it's about the great question of the 1930s. What is real populism and what is demagoguery? Because you've got these demagogues at the time, like Father Coughlin, William Randolph Hearst, and then you've got the real deal over here, the labor movement, Franklin Roosevelt, et cetera. How do you draw the line? What's real and what's real and what is dangerous and fake? And Citizen Kane is one of the movies that tries to do this. So Kane is this William Randolph Hearst. He's a demagogue. And there's a scene where he's running for governor of New York, and he has a rally in Madison Square Garden. And it's a brilliant movie. And anyhow, it's Trump's favorite movie. Did you know this? It's Trump's favorite movie, and I never really understood that until I saw the movie again recently.
Right.
I watched it back in the '80s. They'd show it on network TV, and it was really low resolution. I'd watch it on a old fashioned TV, and it was hard to make out the details. But here I am watching it on high resolution in one of our modern TVs, and the scene where he's in Madison Square Garden, it's absolutely brilliant. But here's Kane giving his speech, and he's talking about how he's in favor. He's going to feed the underfed, and he's going to help out the underprivileged, and all this crap. And he's going to throw the guy who's running against him. He's going to throw that guy in prison, lock him up. Right? And while Kane is speaking, though, behind him is this gigantic poster of his own face with his name in huge letters, Kane. And I'm like, oh my God, that's Trump at the 2016 convention. That's what was behind him, Trump. And and then you realize he watched this movie and he didn't get that Kane was the bad guy.
That's right.
He saw this movie and he's like, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
That's so funny. I'm going to definitely have to watch that again. I watched it, like you said, a while back, so I don't remember the whole concept.
Now that you know about Trump, now that you've seen, and I'll tell you, okay, so I don't want to belabor the point, but at one point in this movie, Kane is, he's given his great speech and he's leaning in. There's a close-up of his face. He's talking to his wife or something, and you see he's got this beautiful tie on, and he's got a stick pin in the tie, and it's the letter K. You can see this now on these modern TVs. It's this big golden letter K. And it's like, oh my God, that's Trump. He puts his, the T. It's on everything.
Yeah, right.
If you go to his winery in Virginia, which I happen to have gone to, and you buy his wine, it's got this big T on it. Everything he touches has to have the T on it. It's like Jesus Christ. Orson Welles called this guy 50 years ago.
Well, it's funny that you said that, and we look, and you go back to movies, and I know this wasn't that far back, but you look at Back to the Future. The second one, they have like kind of the Trump figure, and that was back in the 80s.
Yeah.
So that was funny.
But Citizen Kane is much better. I've seen that one too. I've seen that one too.
Right, but my thing is, and you brought up Nixon too, and how Trump tries to be like Nixon too, and look at one of his aides, Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, exactly. And Pat Buchanan wrote Nixon's speeches. In some ways, Pat Buchanan is the evil genius behind all of this stuff. Wrote, when Nixon came, the phrase, the silent majority, that's Buchanan was the one that came up with that. This is the mastermind of fake populism, Buchanan. And then remember, when he was running for president, there's all of these fake populists in the Republican Party by that point, all of them trying to be folksy and listening to country music, and look at me, I'm wearing blue jeans, and look, I'm eating pork rinds, and all of this crap, right? And here's Pat Buchanan, and he goes one step further. It's like he's against the trade agreements, and they're all like, what? Do you remember? Do you remember? Oh, I'm older than you, but the shock in 1992, and then he did it again in 1996. He called Bob Dole an errand boy for the Business Roundtable. He was attacking the Republicans from the left, and Trump stole everything from this guy. And Buchanan, I read an interview that he did in the Washington Post about a year before the 2016 election, January 2016, and he called it, he was not only not angry at Trump for stealing his act, he was like, go Trump, go. He was overjoyed about it. And he said Trump is going to win, and he called it exactly. He said Trump is going to win Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin and take the election. And this is in January of 2016. The way it comes up in the book, it's just a funny little note. But in the 30s, so I go through the 1890s, 1930s, 1960s, these different periods. And in the 30s, the business community in America came together against Roosevelt in this huge way in 1936. In 1932, when he first ran and was elected president, they didn't really know what to expect from him. It was kind of vague what the New Deal meant. But by 1936, they could see what it meant. It meant, he was going to empower organized labor. He was going to regulate Wall Street. He was going to set up all these public works. He was going to hire unemployed people to build roads. And they were like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. And we got to stop him. And one of the guys who was instrumental in organizing the resistance to Roosevelt was this Wall Street guy called E.F. Hutton. And he wrote a famous article, I think in 1935. He said, addressed to his other tycoons and executives, he said, let's gang up against the New Deal. Let's gang up against Roosevelt. And they did. They all came together and formed this front group, the first of the great right-wing front groups, and just hammered Roosevelt. They had more money than a political party. It was like the Koch brothers times 10. Anyhow, E.F. Hutton built Mar-a-Lago.
Oh, wow.
That was his house. Yeah, and now it's in the hands of Donald Trump.
Wow.
So,
but now was that the start of because the term limit started under Roosevelt?
No, it was after. So once he died, they put that amendment in the
right after he
Constitution.
died. Yeah, that's what I meant. I'm sorry. But that was because these people were ganging up on him, and they figured if they.
Oh no, that came later, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There had always been a tradition of only 2 terms, but Roosevelt could clearly, in 1940 when he ran for his 3rd term, he could clearly see that war was coming, and so that was he didn't want to stop. Also, well, I mean, there's a lot of he had a lot of good reasons for that, but this is when he was running for his 2nd term, and the stuff that I was able to find again. So people study Roosevelt and they study the New Deal. They don't often study the opponents of it and why they hated him so much. And it's the same with populism. Historians love populism. They love to study it. They don't often study the people who hated it and the rhetoric that they used. But the rhetoric against Roosevelt was extraordinary. And a lot of it was scientific racism. It's amazing, this kind of eugenics stuff. These people would say, well, look, the reason you have high unemployment in this country is because a lot of those people are feeble-minded and have bad genes, and they don't really want to work. And the people who are on top in our society are up there because they're like they're really fine people, and they've been genetically chosen over the course of the centuries to rule. And so
that almost sounds like Nazism, doesn't it?
Yeah, and they would And they would throw in, one of them would actually say, look, Hitler has some good ideas. And these are Republicans. And I know, and it does sound like Nazism because it is. And and Roosevelt just beat them hollow. I mean, he kicked the crap out of them. It was, and by the way, they had the newspapers of this country on their side. There was this overwhelming consensus among newspapers to stop Roosevelt, because the newspapers back then were owned by these very wealthy men who regarded themselves as the leading capitalists in their community, and they despised Franklin Roosevelt. And so they came together against him in this extraordinary way, and he kicked their ass in one of the greatest landslides of all time. And people, it's very similar to the 2016 election. There were polls showing that Roosevelt was going to lose. The newspapers were unanimous against him. And afterwards, everybody was like, what happened? What the hell happened? And there's one of the sort of postmortems that I was reading, from like 1937 or something. The guy said, you look at these cities where every newspaper was against Roosevelt, and he would sometimes have, his biggest margins would be in these places. And it was because people hated their local newspapers so much that whatever the newspaper wanted, they're like, hell no, I'm not doing that.
It's such a parallel to what's going on now.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. You're gonna really enjoy this book. The parallels are uncanny. So instead of eugenics, you have meritocracy now. Defined by where you went to college.
This is Thomas Frank here on Fire Breather Rob. Definitely check out his books. I mean, you have Listen Liberal, What's the Matter with Kansas, in his new book, What People Know, and it's talking about populism. Can you explain to the viewers why right-wing populism, and I mean, we talked about it in this country.
Yeah, it's like fake, yeah, but keep going.
But why is it taking over the world? You look at Boris Johnson in England with the Brexit vote. We see, as I said, in Poland, in Italy, too.
Yeah.
And it's really taken over.
There's a really interesting thing going on everywhere you look. And I haven't written about this, but other people have. And that is this sort of the American model, what I talked about in Listen Liberal, where the American Democratic Party became this party of the professional class beginning in the 60s and 70s. And now it's basically, they've done it, right? That's who they are. That's happened here, but that's happened everywhere. in all the Western countries. The left of like the Social Democratic Party in Germany, same thing. The Labour Party in England, same thing. You see this everywhere you go. And that's a huge part of the explanation, is that these parties have openly identified themselves with the meritocratic, highly educated elite. And they have divorced themselves from their own past as working class parties. I mean, the Labour Party in England, that's what they were. I mean, they were founded by the unions. Or the Social Democratic Party in Germany was the same thing. I mean, back in the old days, that was their principles. That's who they were. I mean, Hitler killed these guys, but today they are this party of a different group. And so they're everywhere you go, they are wide open to this kind of fake right-wing version of populism where which is all, by the way, an imitation of what they've seen succeeding in the United States. So, a guy like Jair Bolsonaro, he's looking at America and he's like, yeah, I can do that.
And he's done it. He's done really incredibly bad things, burning down the
he's awful.
rainforest.
He's like the worst politician in the world. I don't know. Boris Johnson is up there too. I mean, these are terrible people. Man. By the way, Margaret Thatcher was no slouch at this. She was very good at it. There's been other politicians who play the game well. Marine Le Pen she looks at Americans and imitates us. Yep.
Well, she lost though in
she did. That's right.
Though. Yeah.
She did. Yep. But she's
she's still involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we talk about this? And you kind of talk about this, and I'm not sure if it's in the book because honestly, like I said, I just got it. But I do want to talk about this. When I think of populism, I do think of Martin Luther King Jr. And he was talking about, obviously, civil rights for Black Americans. But he also talked a lot, and this was kind of right before they murdered him, about economic rights, voting rights.
Oh, no, there's no question about that. He was. So King is one of my characters. One of the people that I admire, and he has a large part in this book, because King, in one of his most famous speeches in 1965, gave a speech about populism. And you can find it on YouTube. It's at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. He gives this climactic speech, and it's one of his great ones. And he talks about the populist movement in the 1890s, which tried to bring together Black farmers and white farmers. And it failed, and it was in fact crushed by the sort of racist white power, elites of the day in the South. And he talks all about that. He knows the whole story, and he actually gets it exactly right. And then he comes in. It's one of his great speeches, and he talks about Southern history, where Jim Crow laws came from, and all this stuff. And then he brings it up to the present, and he compares populism to the Great Society, and you can clearly see that he's drawing a parallel with his own movement. And this is at about that same time, he and his advisors start talking about what's the next step. We've got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We got the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What's our next step? And he says, obviously, the next step is we've got to move into economic rights. We got to pick up where Roosevelt left off. And that was what he was working on when he was assassinated. And he and his associates talked about this and wrote about it all the time. And he wanted to do another march on Washington, a poor people's campaign, a march on Washington. And unfortunately, that all got washed away. This is the late 60s. Guys are getting assassinated. The Vietnam War is in full effect. The Vietnam War sucks all the air out of the room. It makes a guy like Lyndon Johnson, who was a great liberal hero in some ways, it ruins him. It makes him, into a kind of villain. Johnson knows this. It's a disaster for people like you and me. And of course, a disaster for Martin Luther King.
I'm going to piggyback on this before I get to the last question, and then I have a couple of questions about Listen Liberal. What I want to ask is, what is your opinion on the Kennedys? Do you feel like if they didn't get assassinated, that they would have put a lot of good policies into place?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never written about that.
Because you look at John Kennedy and Bobby, because Bobby was in 1968, he looked like he was on his way to win.
So Bobby was, Bobby had the right idea. In 68, he in some ways was the very last one who was really trying to bring together the Black and white working classes. and sort of bring together the Roosevelt coalition for one more try, and they would have prevailed. I mean, so there was all of this arguments. After he was killed, there was no obvious leader anymore, and you know, they settled on McGovern, but obviously he had his problems. And there was all of this debate within the Democratic Party about what they should do. And, you know, this is in Listen Liberal. And what they settled on was to basically say goodbye to labor and to the white working class, and to embrace highly educated people instead as the new sort of leaders of reform. And that has not worked very well. Now, you know, John F. Kennedy was an amazing phrase maker and said wonderful things and had the right ideas, you know, about civil rights and stuff like that. But he was also one of these guys who was really in love with the notion of the professional class running everything. And he brought in what they called the whiz kids into the Pentagon. And these people really were responsible for the Vietnam War. You know, this new generation of intellectuals that came in with Kennedy. And so that was the beginning of a kind of disastrous thing. No, I don't want to pin that too much on Kennedy, because he was a smart man, and he probably would have figured out where he was going wrong, and would have remedied things in a way that Johnson never did. Johnson was terrified of being called weak on communism, you know, of being seen as weak on communism. By the way, so the story of left populism kind of ends in the 1970s. The last guy to really be, up until Bernie Sanders, the last guy to really carry the torch for this was a senator from Oklahoma called Fred Harris. And he actually called himself a populist. Nobody remembers him anymore. He's still alive. I went and interviewed him for the book. He was a heroic man, a great man. Ran this campaign for the presidency with no money. He did it on a shoestring. It was a predecessor of the Bernie Sanders thing, small donations, or of the Obama thing, all these tiny donations. And went around the country doing this, and really had great politics, really perceptive way of seeing. His slogan was, "The issue is privilege." That's what he would say. And he was the last one to really call himself a populist and know something about populism and know what he was talking about. Carter called himself a populist, but what he meant by that was he was a nice guy from the South. Carter, that was a disaster. You know, yeah, he talked all these nice populist phrases in 1976. You know, he would wear blue jeans and go around and say, "Hi, my name's Jimmy Carter. Remember this?" And of course you don't remember it. I remember it though. Everybody loved him, right? It was country music and, you know, all that stuff. And then he gets into office and they jack interest rates up to 20% and they club the economy to the ground, you know. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was, but was he a decent politician though? Or no?
Oh, and at the beginning, yeah, but it was a unique time. People were looking he was very much like Obama in the sense that people were looking for a fresh face who was not tainted by, I mean, everyone was disgusted by Watergate and Vietnam, disgusted. And Carter was not from Washington, came from outside, and was this, you know, seemed like this really unpretentious guy, really down home. He'd say like, I will never lie to you, you know, all this sort of thing. Yeah. And people wanted to, they remember how Obama used to say, everyone projects these ideas onto me? That was Carter. It was exactly the same phenomenon.
Obama came out, if you remember that, he said if his policies were under Reagan, he would be called the moderate Republican.
Yeah, that's right.
If you remember that.
That's where we're at.
Yeah, so it's crazy.
Carter has been a great guy in his retirement. You know, I love what he's doing in his retirement. Right. Very inspiring.
He's the only guy that's actually doing something for the people as far as a former president. The other guys aren't doing it. Bush is painting whatever, and Obama's making speeches to the 1%. So.
Yeah, exactly. As Reagan did before him, you know.
Yeah, so it's a total joke. Thomas Frank here on Fire Breathing Rob. We see the Black Lives Matter protests taking frame right now. I believe that we need to have those protests, but also have economic protests. And because, you know, that's obviously exactly right. we're in a pandemic right now. So what would you say to the progressives listening is how we can get progressives to take populism and the good name populism back?
Oh, that's tough because that's I mean, so because as you know, as a Sanders supporter, it's about having a social movement. Just having a leader is not good enough. I mean, it's good, you know, and Sanders would have been a great president. And there's lots of good Democrats out there who, like Elizabeth Warren, who would be great presidents. But a leader is not enough. You've got to have a social movement. And the only social movement I've seen in a long time that has any potential to become that is Black Lives Matter. And, you know, you look at those protests that they were having like a month ago, you know, incredible, really incredible, inspiring. Now, then the thing is, will they be, and Black Lives Matter, the saying, the slogan itself is very populist, extremely so. The question in my mind now is, will they take the next step, the next obvious step, which is to move to economic protest? You know, to start taking on the system, the economic system. And when they do that, then you will have a populist movement on your hands. Now, the thing is, there's all sorts of forces trying to pull them away from doing that, you know, woke capitalism, you know, which is like, and so we're going to see in the next couple of years who comes out on top.
Well, we see that, and I agree. And you brought up some of these points with populism in general and how the left and even the right are trying to downgrade it. We see with Trump, he's calling them Antifa. And we also see that, you know, some of these police departments are putting their own people out there to break windows, start riots.
Oh, yeah. It's bad news. Yeah.
And we saw that in the 60s under
oh, of course, absolutely,
under those social movements too.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's the same playbook.
That was much worse though back then, much worse.
Right.
You know, let's hope we don't see anything like that happening. And yeah, you're exactly. There's all kinds of crazy skullduggery. What I meant, of course, was
right.
The idea and the principle and the outrage, and we, you know, that we need to hold on to that. But no, there's no excuse for arson ever, or for any of that kind of thing. That's totally unacceptable. But this is a movement that is just starting to feel its power, and I hope it continues and takes us in the right direction, because it really can. It would be great if that happened. I
agree.
If you go to my website, tcfrank.com, I've got a bunch of the illustrations from it. Okay. So this is my first book ever that has color illustrations, and a lot of them are really fun, and you'll get the message and the idea of the book right away when you look at these illustrations. That is that there's been this sort of reactionary movement that tries to suppress popular movements for economic democracy, and I call this anti-populism. And it's the same then as it is today. I mean, the words are only slightly different, but the images and ideas are the same. It's shocking once you understand this. It becomes instantly obvious. So check it out on my website, tcfrank.com, and buy the damn book.
I agree,
it's good.
100%.
It's good.
And not only this book, but the other books that you've put out with What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal, and there's a bunch of other ones I know you have.
Yeah. Yep.
Haven't read yet.
But those are the most popular ones that you just
right.
mentioned.
But definitely check those out. Thomas Frank, thanks so much for your time.